Amount of greenery beneath it as it does so, and it comes up with something called the normalized difference vegetation index, which is a measure of how green the land area of the planet is. And it's quite clear that for the last 30 years it's been increasing. So between 1982 and 2011, 20.5% of the vegetated area of the planet got greener and 3% got browner. So net, there is an increase in greenness all over the planet. Now, to start with, people thought, well, that's just farming. You know, where we're farming, we're using fertilizer and irrigation, so we're making things greener. But then they looked at it in more detail and said, well, no, it's not just in the farmland areas, it's also in forests. Well, maybe it's because northern forests are getting greener because the Earth's getting a little bit warmer, and so Canada and Siberia, yeah, sure, the forests are growing a little bit faster there too. And then they thought, well, maybe it's also nitrogen fertilizer, we're using more fertilizer. Well, that has a bit of an effect, but it turns out that some of the fastest greening is happening in places like the Amazon and the middle of Africa, where there's very little nitrogen fertilizer available, and where it's not because the climate's got warmer, because the climate's not changed much there, and it's anyway quite warm enough. It turns out that there is actually a net greening happening all over the world, places like the Amazon rainforest. And so what people like Ranga Maineni of Boston University have done is they've drilled down into the detail of the actual pixels of the planet to try and work out what's going on. And they find that they can explain about half of it by increases in rainfall. Because the world is a little bit warmer, we've got more evaporation from the ocean, there's more moisture in the air, we get slightly heavier rainfall, so we tend to get a little more greening. So for example, the Sahel region in northern Africa, between the Sahara and the equator there, has got considerably greener over the last 30 years. In contrast, by the way, to what was predicted when I was younger, which was that the Sahel was going to get drier and the Sahara was going to advance. There's been a considerable net greening of the Sahel. But the other half of the greening, Maineni concludes, and he hasn't published this yet, but he's talked about it in talks, the other half of that greening comes from carbon dioxide itself. In other words, the fact that we're putting more carbon dioxide into the air means there's more fuel to grow plants. And when a plant has more carbon dioxide in the air, it doesn't have to open its pores so much, so it doesn't lose so much water in absorbing the carbon dioxide that it needs to grow. And so there's tons of experiments now showing that plants grow faster if there's more carbon dioxide in the air. Roughly speaking, on average, for a 200 parts per million increase in carbon dioxide in the air, you get a 30% improvement in plant growth. That's experiments both in the field and in the laboratory. So it's really quite a remarkable phenomenon here. Because of the burning of fossil fuels, we're making the planet greener. It's an astonishing discovery, I think. I think it's rather amazing. And of course, it's an incredibly unwelcome discovery for the environmental movement. They don't want to hear this at all. And how is it possible? I mean, after all, weren't we supposed to be devastating the planet? The population has doubled in my lifetime. The population of the world has doubled. We're about 7 billion people. We were about 3.5 billion when I was born. It's not all my fault, but it has increased. And of course, and during that time, instead of getting poor and miserable and hungry like we were told, actually we're getting considerably better fed and healthier. We're living 30% longer on average than when I was born. And we've got 25% more food per head than when I was born. So in other words, despite doubling the population, we've got more food to go around than we had when I was young, and yet the Earth is getting greener. This hasn't come at the expense of the ecosystem. So there's something wrong with the model that says that economic growth comes at the expense of resources, at the expense of the environment. It's certainly possible, at least until this point, to have an improving environment and an improving living standards and an increase in numbers of people. And when you think about it, it's pretty obvious what's going on to some degree. If you take, for example, food, we use 65% less land to produce the same amount of food as we did in 1960, 50 years ago. That's an accurate measure that's been done by Jesse Orzabel and Paul Waggoner and colleagues at Rockefeller University. They've taken all the different crops in the world and they've measured the changes in yield in different parts of the world, and they've summed it all up, and the crop production index shows that you need about a third as much land to produce the same amount of food as you would have done 50 years ago. And that means, of course, that you don't need so much land, so you can spare a lot of the land. They actually calculate that we've now passed peak farmland. In other words, we're not going to need as much farmland from now on to feed a growing population of the world. We're actually going to cut the amount of farmland we had. Or rather, we would be able to cut that number if it wasn't for the biofuels program. I'll come back to that in a minute, but that's the spanner in the works. And they reached that conclusion despite making very conservative assumptions about the rate of population growth, about the rate at which people will take up meat eating in poor countries as they get richer, etc. They make all these assumptions, and they say that even if you assume some pretty high rates of increased consumption and increased numbers, we're still going to need less and less farmland as we go into the future. As Indo Goklani has calculated, we farm about 38% of the land surface area of the planet at the moment. If we were using the yields of 1960, we'd need to farm 82% of the planet area. Bang go the rainforests, bang go the swamps, bang go the deserts. You know, there would be nothing left for nature if we were doing that. So thank goodness for nitrogen fertilizer, which is what has made this possible. But of course, where does nitrogen fertilizer come from? It comes from the air, but we make it with methane. We use fossil fuels to make it. So if it wasn't for fossil fuels, we'd be in a lot more trouble naturally.